You guys already did it?
Okay, Matt, he wants to take 2 minutes. Okay.
After all that planning, it's finally starting.
That's great now. What happens, happens. Good afternoon, everybody. I just need to ask you a technical question. All of this afternoon's organisation is Emmanuel. It's got nothing to do with me apart from the room. I just need to know, does everyone intend to go on from here to the reception, or there's some people who aren't going? You're not? Just one person? Okay, 2.
You're the only one.
So there are about, how many people? About 40. So what we're going to do is Eilat is going to order 10 taxis to be here at 4:30, which means even if you're in the middle of a session, 4:30, you get up and leave, whatever they tell you. And every 4 of you will take a taxi together, okay? She just wants to know how many taxis to order. So I think about 10 will be about right.
And could you remind us, where do we go exactly?
So,
What should we tell the taxi driver?
no, they'll know, they'll know.
Okay, right.
It's still Village Beach.
Why?
Somebody,
Okay, let's do 11 taxis.
Okay, so,
Take a count.
and I've also got a car which can take 2, 3, 4 people.
Oh, yeah, no, so we're okay, and there are 11 cars, 10 taxis per one.
Okay, so we'll order 10 for now. If we need to, we can order another one, take a few minutes to come. Okay, nice to see you.
Welcome, everyone, to the beginning of the 21st Century Borders. I'm Matt Morrison, Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, we call PNWER, out in the Pacific Northwest, 5 states, 5 provinces. I'm representing here the Practitioners Advisory Board with Martin, and I'm just really excited. I think there couldn't be a more important time for scholars to be gathering to look at borders. And I say that with all sincerity. It's a really very moving for me that you're here and that we can focus this session on the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emmanuel, and Emmanuel, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I give you money to come, but I'm expected. I expected fewer people to actually show up. So I'm really delighted to see that, the big family is here. And I mean the big family, the Borders and Globalization family. It's a huge trip. It's far. I know the conference was a big attraction, and that's kind of, that's also why I thought it would be nice to have a workshop that would run as a shoulder of the conference, where we could discuss day or session after session, basically what we're going to do together for the next 5 years, probably even 6 years, right? Because with SHIRC, I applied for 7 years to have funding for 7 years, but we can extend by a year or a year and a half fairly easily, which is what we did on the previous grant. So the way that the day goes is I would like to discuss the grant proposal very briefly with you, like the big themes and stuff like this. And that's, in my mind, that's kind of the foundation. Some of you are going to see this, or you've read the documents and you will think that, it's not innovative enough, whatever. I want to be very clear on this. If you think that the hypotheses in the grant are not interesting, you should step out. I'm really blunt, I know, but it's gone through 8 blind reviews. I worked almost 2.5 years on this, and we have lots of money to share. We can do all kind of really fun things, but we cannot change the 2 pillars. We have to work within them. But within this framework, I would like us to discuss, and that's why we have these 9 panels, right? I would like us to discuss what we can do within these 2 pillars over the next 9 sessions, the next 3 days, plus obviously on the bus on Wednesday and so on and so forth. And that's the idea. We are making basically the grant happen when we are starting a discussion like this, right? It's kind of a strategic discussion without actually really looking at the strategy. It's just a way that every one of you, because you're creative, because you have your own ideas, you have your own knowledge, you have your own interests, your own methodologies, you can basically adapt and find some ways to make those different pods that we've created, right? The different areas of research that we created with Borders and Globalization work together. Most of you in the room are formally part of BIG. There are a few people who are not formally part of BIG, but you know, the contractualization is not closed. And I have to add this, I lost Stephanie at the end of December because she became the assistant to the vice president engagement at the University of Alberta. And that's a well-paid job with all the perks that UVic doesn't offer. But I had 12 candidates for the job, and we have done a short list. We have 6 that we're going to interview when I go back to Victoria. And Nicole has taken kind of the flag helping me, so things are going to work out this way. So this is why we're together. I thought it would be very important to basically discuss the grant and think, you know, kind of how you write your own contribution to this grant over the next few years, knowing that a little bit like cats, academics always do one thing and then suddenly they have another interest and it's impossible to actually organize things very well. BIG was very successful, so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start with the money piece and then discuss BIG. And then I'll go through the 2 pillars and go a little bit more in depth on pillar 2. And then we have Jeff Contessa, who's going to come and discuss pillar 1. Now, the question that I have for you that I would like to see discussed during the next 9 panels that we have is, are you going to write your future research with BIG within pillar 1 or pillar 2? Very important point. You have then to read very carefully how it's written in the 8-page. You have to, and I'll insist on this, the conceptual integrity of the grant has to be respected in the writing so that we are all working together that way, right? Advancing research in border studies. You can be across the 2 pillars if you're interested, depending on the themes like, you know, the theme of security, environment. Yeah, there are already ideas that were discussed at the airport this morning. Sanjay, you can take the floor later on that, obviously, right? But all of you are going to have ideas that, you know, we can connect the 2 pillars in ways that were not written in the grant. As long as we respect the integrity of the 2 pillars, we can obviously create these relations. And so I don't think we can resolve everything today, but I think that by the end of the conference, everybody, and I mean, you know, by Thursday night, everybody will have their own personal idea how you can contribute and how we can basically start working for the next 6-7 years, well, 5-6 years on publications and training and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's just to start. So we have 3 hours. And we have myself and then Jeff, and then we have the first panel that Christian led with his team, and where we can start discussing border security issues from different perspectives. So I'll start, I want to start with this. So the first thing is this, the money issue. I will send you this slide so you don't need to write it, but there is a link at UVic for this form, which you have to fill up And it's important to know that people who are from outside of Europe and the Middle East get 1,600 Canadian dollars. But you have to send us all of your expenses, right? So we know how much you spend. If you spend $2,500 to come, we need to know you spent $2,500. And then we pay you back $1,600, right? For sure. And then the Europeans, you get $1,200. Okay, and the form, and if you need help, Jen Swift, that's the email you can write her. Copy Big Manager every time. Right, so when you submit your expenses, that way it's standardized, it's easy. You also need to sign these documents, so I know that you were here. Everybody should sign it. It's part of the. Now, Borders in Globalization. The previous grant ended up, you'll see, by 2023, we will have published 15 books, 8 special issues of journals, and overall it's 109 papers or book chapters. So I think, you know, when I submitted, I suggested that we do 80 reports and possibly half of that number of articles. So we have done way more than I ever dreamt of. So the big program was quite successful that way. And these are the numbers that Nicole has collected. Oh, what I need to add is that I am not counting papers who have been done under the label big, but do not acknowledge the grant number or the Borders in Globalization program. And there are a number of colleagues who have not been very careful. Nicole has documented all of this very carefully, and we're finishing the report this year. So we're going to be publishing this with, you know, summaries of every single area, so the 6 areas that we started working on, and so on and so forth. And here you have some of the numbers. Look at the amount of money that we spent on students. We had declared that we would train maybe 80 students. We trained more than 200. So it's, as a network impact, it's been quite significant. And I have some colleagues, inspectors, thank you, who have been very strong. Victor is one of them, right? Very, very strong contribution in terms of student training, like surprising, because it's not always a relationship to the money that a university receives or something like this. It's also that, you know, you have a system that helps and so on and so forth. So that's why we have this incredible number. And as of today, we have 11 books published, but we have a few more that, you know, are not there. For instance, the book that is coming next year by Christian, and so on and so forth. We had 11 summer school, we're gonna have more. We have the total budget. We have the number of participants in open online courses, the followers, so on and so forth. What surprised me is the number of YouTube clicks, right? 11,000 people are looking at our small videos. I don't know if you remember when we did the Ottawa conference, almost every single people who were there, every single colleague, we did a 2-minute snapshot, 5 minutes for some of them. That's extremely successful. It's used in classes everywhere. That's why you have this crazy number. So we can do the same, obviously, with the new grant, right? And that's kind of the idea I have here. Now, just very briefly, let me put this full screen. The new grant. We have 15 non-academic partners. It's a big deal because we need to work with all of them. We have Pillar 1 partners and Pillar 2 partners. We have basically indigenous communities that are working with us, and we have organizations like Pacific Northwest Economic Region, MOD, the AEBR, the Association of European Border Regions, and many others, Time, you know, and so on and so forth. So we have quite a few partnerships outside the grant, the World Customer Organization, I don't name them all, but you have them here on the list. And one of my concerns, and I'll show you in the detail at the end of the presentation where we're standing there too, but one of the things is that it's actually very interesting from a research perspective to engage with policymakers, but it's also, difficult work. It takes time. You have to work with them. You have to understand what their priorities are, and so on and so forth. So I need everybody's help there. And I know when you're driven academics and you really want to publish top-notch research, sometimes you don't have time for policy engagement. But with this grant, it's actually quite important that we try to do this first. In the first big grant, we kind of discovered with whom we could work. But now we have some very strong support. Penware is a great support. AVR is a great support. Time is a great support. Mott is a great support, and so on and so forth. I don't list them all. Well Custom, they're not here, but they've been amazing as well. And so it's important to, if you're interested in the areas of policy and border that they are actually working on, you should remember that it would be nice to show interest and then get engaged, right, on this. The Congress of Nation and State is a new organization that has been courting us, and they organized a conference. They've got Jeff Contassa's support, and I think we're gonna have an agreement with them. The way we conceptually thought about working with these partners is basically a cycle, right, which would be written over a period of 1 year, where we basically discuss a year ahead of time what should come 12 months later, comes out 12 months later. So, we basically start with agreements, but then the whole idea that we have is that if you look at monthly meeting, if you look at the way the cycle works, right, we basically discuss this for 6 years, but every year we go back to the partnerships and we discuss them, and we try to produce that way new research by a period of 12 months. And the funding, the grants that are available for researchers, for students, for instance, MA students, we have, I think, 15 Canadian dollars. For PhD, it's $18,000 and so on and so forth. The idea behind all of this is that you are able to have a student with you, and we fund it for that duration of time. So when we do the partnership and when we write this on paper, that's basically what guides my rationale and should guide yours. So we can always make amendments, but that's the way we see this. Now, I just want to go into the two pillars a little bit. When we finished Borders and Globalization, I had a sense that we had been able to establish that more and more states, at least in the Western world, because of diplomatic relations, because of bureaucratic capacity, because of financial capacity, because of technology, were able to basically organize bordering processes beyond their territorial border, right? They are able to pre-clear individuals and goods thousands of kilometers away from the territory of the state, the territoriality. So pillar one is, pillar two. So pillar one is basically looking at challenges inside the states and at the periphery of the states that comes from inside the state. So it's, indigenous nations basically wanting, who have sovereign claims. It's, so nationhood, it's something that we are quite familiar with in North America, which I think some of you are less familiar with. But this is also forms of nationalism that we've seen elsewhere. Now, I have colleagues who have these issues, but probably don't formulate them this way outside of the Western world, like India, China, Brazil, right? There are lots of indigenous claims. There are lots of smaller nations, language, culture that are challenging in borderlands, that are sometimes in very difficult relations with their central states. And I would like to study them more. And Jeff will discuss this more, obviously, but that's basically the focus of pillar one. We have conceptual issues behind this, right? How do we discuss nationhood with nationalism, for instance, which in the literature is not very clear. Yet, some of these phenomena are really close, right? Some of the radicalization, for instance, of certain communities in Europe who have their own language, who are, are very close to some of the claims and have similar claims. Transnistria, for instance, I'm thinking that's an example in the middle of Europe that are quite similar to ideas that we see also as indigenous claims in North America, in Latin America, in Asia, and in Europe as well, right? With the salmons, for instance, right? So it's important to have a look at this, but Jeff will come back and discuss this. So I'm going to focus a bit more on Pillar 2. Pillar 1 focuses on these territorial claims within the state or at the periphery of the state. Pillar 2 looks at this from a globalization perspective, right? We look at how certain mechanisms now have been created, not always equal. They use similar technologies like biometry or barcode and the ability to trace the movement of goods and go as far as inside a firm. And what is fascinating is to realize that you have the technology to basically identify a barcode that has the right to cross certain kinds of countries. But what you also see is that the World Customs Organization today is interested in standardizing this. So we've done a survey with them, it's been presented already, and they are working on standardization of all of the data that is collected by states. Right, so progressively within the next 5 to 10 years, certainly a core number of states member of the World Customs Organization is going to have to standardize this data. They're going to work together. The committees already exist. I was supposed to present our research next Friday. I will be doing it in March. And so this process on the mobility, the flow of goods is a process that is also influencing immigration. And that's where I think we need to be careful and also study how technology is basically driving all of this. So pre-clearance and all these mechanisms. So in Pillar 2, this is where I would like to go. There are all kinds of things that we should study there. We can look at this from the perspective of regulatory systems. And I just want to highlight, if you've looked at Brexit, if you've studied Brexit, you know it's a nightmare because over 100 agencies in the UK are involved. The staffing necessity, right, from a UK perspective, is twice as much staff as they've ever had over the last 50 years. They have to train 5,000 new customs officers, and all of the private sector has to adapt. All of the trade with the rest of the world used to be done in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, cannot be done in Amsterdam and Rotterdam anymore, has to be done inside the UK. The number of customs slips has been multiplied by 5, so 50 million customs slips with 200 million customs slips just for Europe. Now we're dealing with 255 million customs slips. And then you've got the whole immigration numbers that are coming there, that are compounding, right? So this is kind of the environment that illustrate the question that I would like us to look into a little bit more. There are issues of technologies, there are issues of regulation, there are issues that, as Sanjay was saying to me, we should also look at the post-COVID. Right? What are the medical ideas that states have started to use, like the new passports and so on and so forth? Where is this all going? So this is kind of the way I see two areas of studies that are going in different directions, right? But obviously they're links. Security is a big link. I think regulatory mechanisms, whether it's private sector or public sector regulations, that's another area that we should connect all of this, right? According to Simon Dalby, who's still working with us, he's not here because he doesn't like to travel and he's retired, but Simon was saying to me, for the environment, we have the same issues. And you probably have ideas how we can go a bit further. So I just want to detail this a bit more. On the issues of self-determination, I'll let Jeff, and I shared all of this with Jeff last night. So he's fully aware of the fact that, I say, first self-determination, nationalist movements internal regulatory systems, right? You have lots of states where the problem of the, if you want, self-determination and nationhood claims are disconnected from the legal systems that actually constrain them, right? There are no discussions. It's all regulated by police or military. It's quite violent. So how do you deal with, Kashmir and Jammu? How do you deal with peripheries of Brazil? How do you deal with the Samis if you can't actually? So the Europeans have this great thing is that they have a Charter of Human Rights that has been signed by all the states, and all EU regulations go back to the top of the pyramid. So that's one of the fundamental texts. They have a number of treaties and so on and so forth. But most of the states are not even looking at this. So it creates really all kind of disruptions that are quite impossible to resolve, right? And we have, I'm thinking, I was talking to Everett about this at lunch. The India-Bangladesh case, 150, the name just escaped me.
Enclaves.
Enclaves, 155, 53 enclaves, right? How do you resolve this? Right? So no wonder people get shot. No wonder you have fences. The states can't even talk to each other. On the Pakistan-India border, you've got, 600 or 700 kilometers of ditch, and then shoot to kill with fencing and lights. And there are NGOs that collect the number of deaths per day. I mean, right, we have lots of material that we can use to do this, right? The local people who speak, dialect of Punjabi and so on and so forth, or dialect of Jammu, they don't know this stuff. They have ancestral relations across the boundary line. They used to live in that huge watershed that, East Punjab, basically divided by their boundary line. They never thought about this. They're uneducated, most of them, right? The educated ones have moved away and live in the big cities now. Now, this is just a case, right? But there are so many instances all over the world that I think, and coming obviously in North America. In North America, I think the systems are quite slow, but there are discussions. We have now, in Canada, for instance, we have truth and reconciliation recommendations and so on and so forth. So it's all process-based, regulatory-based. There are discussions on different parts of all these recommendations and so on and so forth. But it's not the case everywhere. So it's important to kind of do comparative policy relevant research there, right? Jeff will come back to this and talk more. Now, the part that I think is really kind of the part I would like to supervise is the pillar 2, and it's all about these mobile borders. Is how do states basically are creating these processes where they partner, right? You cross the border. When you come back to Canada, you're in Brussels. I saw this like in the summer. Somebody was refused entry on the plane. And the agent was saying, I can't get you on the plane. I'm sorry, my computer, I'm not giving you the right to get on the plane. And that's it. It's pre-clearance. So we see these mechanisms really face, it's in our face. We have biometry. When you have biometric passports, you come in and outside of Europe, you don't even realize it, right? And soon enough, we may not even need passports, but the pre-clearance system will be there. So I think it's really important that we start looking at this, right? What I call resulting cross-border connectivity, transnational regulation, and form of sovereignty, and how this is kind of basically expanding the reach of certain states, right? Expanding the processes across boundaries. And Canada custom, for instance, now you find agents in Brussels, you find them at the major harbors. I don't know how many agreements Canada has, but the last time I looked, it was like over 50. And it means with Canadian agents in 50 harbors and airports across the world, working on the agreements and pre-clearance, implementing them. So I want us to think about these questions because it's very important. Canada, US, we've had agreements, for now, for I would say 55, 60 years. We are starting to disconnect right now. Matt was saying to me, but it's quite traumatic to realize that the relationship between Canada and the US is tense to the point that certain soft diplomatic agreements that function extremely well for the last 2 generations are being dismantled just because people are not talking to each other. So these are kind of the mechanisms that I want us to kind of look into, because we have, in a way, a big European machinery. We have the Chinese machinery that is trying to create all this connectivity, to create these processes, right? You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the China Initiative, and you can see that it's managed by China's private sector, but the private sector owned in most of the case by the state as well. They buy railroad, they buy seaports, they buy airports, they start to organize all of this, they staff them. They also have adjudicators in the international tribunals and so on and so forth, right? So they create their own systems. Europe has also created regulations in that same, they don't staff them, but Europe has regulations and systems that are also being placed, and they negotiate them with the US, with Canada. We see all these agreements coming into place. So these borders are being pushed out in many different ways, but what is the resulting thing? It's a bit like, free trade agreements, where you basically agree on certain functions of state and you manage them together. So in some of the writing that we've done with Todd and Christian and the team and Jamie, we talk about cooperation, collaboration, coordination as different ways of basically trusting each other and having mechanisms that are, insidious, but are really linking bureaucracies, bureaucratic mechanism, rule of law together, ways to act and to intervene in really similar manners, right? So I think it's really important to go much more into this. And if you don't mind, before Jeff comes online, we could focus on Pillar 2. You could tell me, ask questions, raise comments, give me ideas, give everybody's ideas, share a little bit more on how this is, how we could study this. I certainly would like to have studies on seaports and airports and regulatory systems and immigration agreements and the regulatory system behind, right? Look at custom and immigration. These are the 2 big, sub-pillar, but looking physically, we could study like 10 airports, we could study 10 seaports, we could look, regulatory systems in certain areas. We could do, for instance, free trade agreements. We could decide, we could look at, immigration pact. We could do all kind of, different areas, but look into them, look at the great literature, and then do interview work or do data collection work and so on and so forth, right? And then we can also link this to not just security, but also the environment, other questions, right? If you're interested, let's say in biometric, or if you're interested in, how the web is, certain softwares are forbidden in certain states, but yet they exist in other states and so on and so forth. So all of these systems that used to stop at the boundary line are now open in some regions of the world. In other regions, they are unable to function. So all these different options, I think, are really fascinating for us to look at. Why is it that certain states or certain regions like the EU are able to work very well with certain parts of the world and not others? Right? Like, I'm always surprised how the EU has managed so many, in a way, policy parallelism with Morocco, but why is it not working as well with Tunisia? Why has it been more or less successful with, Israel and with Egypt, but not with Lebanon, not with Russia? I mean, actually, it's quite striking when you look at Morocco. Morocco is almost a member of the EU without being a fully fledged member. They get €1 billion per year. That's redistribution, right? So it's kind of, these are the questions that I'm thinking about on security issues, on immigration, on mobility, on trade. If you sell strawberries in Morocco, you're part of the common market. And I mean, these are kind of, why is it that strawberry trading and farming in Morocco would be part of the common market, but if you do some other product, you are not part of it. Anyway, so all kind of questions, but I think this is kind of Pillar 2, and in my mind, it's kind of really important. Okay, I don't need to go through all of this because it's in the papers that I shared with you, but I basically here expand a little bit on what I just said more theoretically. And I plead with you here. We've only started to document these changes. We have some literature on this, but we don't have a lot of field work. So I'll say what I said when we started with big. All I want us to do is dig some new data, but really do data gathering that instead of just discussing this theoretically, we want to do comparative policy relevant research. We want to have some things that we can discuss with policymakers so they understand this new world, right? They don't have the consultants that come to us and say, we could do these new things. They actually know strategically why they want to do certain things, right? This is kind of why we have the summer institutes and, anyway, I'm pleading with you that, documenting these new mechanisms, comparing them, doing really empirical work, using this to train our students is really fascinating. And I think it's worth it. It's worth our energy or time. We get paid for that as well, obviously, which is not a small detail. So, what is the central knowledge contribution here that I see? It's like a transformation, right? My colleagues in the room who are geographers will think that maybe I attack them a little bit here. I don't attack geography. What I'm saying is that we have a geography that looks at states when we do geopolitics, and we need to think beyond the territoriality. That's all I'm saying. So the territorial trap is kind of something that we actually have to kind of pick at and try to think beyond the territorial trap. Spatiality has not disappeared. The territory is still there. But states are partnering in different ways and multiple ways that go beyond the state. And that we have to recognize. We have to do research to understand how it's happening and why it's happening. In some regions of the world, it's very successful. In others, it's not. And I really would like to understand why, right? So I write this like, document how changes increasingly challenge the territoriality. We started doing this with big. Now I think we can go beyond. We can really look at connectivity issues. We can really look at technological issues. We can look at, the collaboration around regulation, the alignment of regulation, and so on and so forth, right? Why is it that Canada and the EU are able to align on so many policies and the US and the EU are unable to do this? I don't know. This is, why are there committees that meet now basically every month between Ottawa and the EU, and then the US has a difficult relationship here? I don't know. But I think we should look at the implication, right? Okay. So some of these borders, and I'll just stop with this, to document how these new invisible borders may also contribute to closing the. So the whole issue is that if I have some of you that are interested in, the web, can you program in Python and look at Twitter and Facebook, and can you start doing, looking at connection through Google and all this stuff? These are areas that are moving really fast. And I think it would be really interesting to look at how they close certain culture, but also open others, right? Just the way they're closing certain regions to security and opening others. Right? Free flow of trade, and then we close Britain completely out of the EU, and nobody had seen it forthcoming, right? And then everybody's upset about it. Okay, so I know I have to run, so I want to finish. Now, this is the last part, and I started with this a little bit. I know, when I write grants like this, I'm very pragmatic. I just want to win the grant. So I read, it's very clear. I read what SHIRC wants, or I read what the Jean Monnet program wants, or the Erasmus+. I won an Erasmus+ recently with a team. It's all out of the University of Iceland. You read inside the wording of what they are asking you, what they want you to write, what they want you to research, right? The problem that we have after that is that we end up signing contracts on very specific research things. And so I want to come back to this. It's important to respect the integrity of the grant because it's contractual. They are becoming harder. So the EU program are way harder. They make us write at the level of research proposals, right? We have to basically write proposals once you've won the grant for every research that we do, the Erasmus Plus that I won. We have 10 packages. Each package has to write a 10-pager to explain how we're going to do 6 case studies. And they want to know the methodology, the lit review, the questions, and the policy implications. SHRC is moving in that direction a bit behind, right? But SHRC is also there with the partnership. So I really insist on this. I have to be careful about the integrity of the grant. If you think that the hypothesis and the foundations that we have is not for you, you need to talk to me. Because I have a contractual obligation, and my university will only look at the rule, the implication of the rules that we have, and the money. And they'll close the account. If we don't do what we're supposed to do, they'll just close our account. So if we have some issues with certain partners, the lawyers are involved, and it's really a disaster. Right? So I don't want to be there, but it's important to be aware of it. The theoretical integrity and the cohesion of the grant is important. So we've got 2 pillars, let's respect them. But let's be creative within the pillars, right? We have that creativity, we can work across the pillars, we can find all kind of ways to do this. I anticipate some issues with timeline, but with BIG, we had the same issue, and then in the end, it worked out very well. We were what? We're still publishing. We're 9 years in the grant, and he's publishing next year. Next fall, he's got a book coming out of University of Michigan, so it's okay. So I'm not too worried about the timeline. We'll be late. I think academics are always late. I don't know any academic that is ahead of time anyway. I mean, show me one. Maybe Victor, you always write faster than I think. And Laurie's a bit like this too. No, I don't know, but anyway, I don't know. I know I'm always late. Ask Christian. But my timeline is between tomorrow and 9 months later, about. So anyway, there we go.
ideas.
30 minutes left.
Okay, we should close there. Yeah, okay, so the last thing is this. We have agreements, we have contracts. Let's use the money for students. That's kind of what we have in the grant. So try to work a year at a time, get a student into an MA or into an honors thesis at the undergrad level, or a PhD student, in year 2, once they are in the writing process, to work on, let's say, a chapter or 2 chapters. Let's work on these cycles. And then that's where I want to kind of close. We have a number of activities that should the student spotlight. We have the Summer Institute, we have, the policy partnerships. Where is it? The student seminars. What we could do, and we have funding for this, is bring them together 6 or 9 times a year, all across the world, right? And they could discuss. So, we have students who come from so many different disciplines, but at least all of them over a period of, let's say, the first 6 months that they work, they could meet a network from across the world, and we could run, I take the leadership, but with some of your help, we could run seminars where they do some reading, discuss their project, meet the team internationally, and so on and so forth. So we draw them in, and then by the time they finish their MA, they have, a good knowledge of the literature. They've written an MA in an area, maybe a silo, and they realize they're part of a network that, expands across 15 countries. Is that an open mind? Is that a way to blow them up and make them think worldwide? And I don't know. Realize that they're not, outside of, my beautiful British Columbia, my little beautiful Victoria, my garden on the seaside where the temperature is between 18 and 25, and I can walk at night without worrying that somebody's going to come and whatever, right? So it's kind of this training that I think would be so beneficial. And the last thing I want to say is this. See, our non-university partners here, I have funding for every single one of these activities. So year 1 and 2, you'll be surprised that we did them all. But at some point here, I'm going to be really tired.
Me too.
So you're actually one of the ones who tell me, okay, Maria, next year we do, what do we do next year? This year we did education across border. Next year we do
Labor market.
labor market. I don't know, Matt, I'm not going with you, but so World Custom, they ask us data. We did that big study, right? We looked at standard of data gathering across. And we did 80 states during the summer, and nobody could believe that we'd done 80 states. And now they said, we don't need it anymore. We just want you to come and give us the presentation and show us where it overlaps so we can have the discussions. I think within 2 or 3 years, the lead, by the way, is from India, the head of custom in India. I miss you, Gupta. Anyway, I'll share the information, but it's an international team, and they are going to create recommendations for all the states to standardize around very specific so that they can create worldwide database to help the states basically, you know how custom work, right? They have huge national databases right now, and they look at error in the trade flow around very specific number. So, you know, let's say a component of electronic. Every error is an indicator of some trafficking. Tiny minuscule error in the data sets. They want to be able to do this with reference worldwide. So when you have 2 or 3 or 4 states that are major trader, if we take the top 4 trader with Canada or with India, Saudi Arabia, China, so on and so forth, suddenly you control across one product, all of the trade or one type of good and the different components, right? And you can actually go and use your staff to identify where the traffics are. So that's what they're after. I think we should study these things. Okay, thank you very much. Questions, comments, anything, you know, whatever. Tell me, what do you think? Where are we going?
Oh, Manuel, the conference mentioned in year 2, has it been held?
That's the conference, year 2. We're still in year 2. So what I want us to do, right, and just for all of you, because we're starting with this afternoon, I want us to have debates and discuss research proposal. You all came with kind of a paper to the conference, but really what I'm interested in is the future. This is what I've asked all the chairs for every one of the panels that we are organizing through BIG. So even if you come with a paper, please talk about the future, at least within the big session. Obviously, if you give a paper elsewhere, talk about your research. But here, let's work through that workshop, right? And then, you know, think about how you align your proposal with the pillar 1 and 2, the research grant integrity. That's the whole idea. That's it. I'm done. Thank you. Workshop. We're not here to.
No more clapping. Emmanuel, just the last point here. Do you see it as desirable to have issues and research agendas straddling both pillars, or would you rather see this to, in a way, protect their integrity and then be, you know, quite focused? Yeah. I'm just wondering, is it, you know, something we could do, or which we actually are encouraged to?
Can I follow up on that too? Because I had a little bit of the same concern, because I think it's a little bit hard to separate them. It might be sort of inorganic at times.
I think for some colleagues, it's counterintuitive for them to actually not separate, to actually separate them.
Yeah.
For some colleagues, they totally understand pillar 1 as its own, right? If you discuss this with Jeff, he's got very little interest in globalization. He has some interest in what he calls indigenous internationalism, but it's outside of globalization, right? So I think But, you know, and I've sensed it through early discussion that I have colleagues, you know, that are basically echoing your questions. It's like, your interests straddle the two, so I'm happy with this. But I think it's also important that we have enough studies within each one of the pillars. Again, as long as we respect the integrity, like the question that I asked within the two pillars and we are working around them, we're safe, we're good, right? There is creativity, obviously. There is, I don't know what you call this, scientific intuition before you formulate an hypothesis and you dig. I don't know, right? But it's kind of the idea. I know I'm not answering clearly the question.
No, well, this is great, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. It is an incredibly rich project, goes without saying, to decide the future of water studies in different parts of the world. Looking at the two research pillars, something that came to my mind was that as we look at the pillar 1 and the pillar 2, and the intersections of the bordering, ordering, and othering processes, how much space will we have to really go beyond the continental frame, the terrestrial frame? We have the oceanic sphere, we have a vertical geopolitics in the sense that right from the deep sea bed into the outer space, to the cyberspace, and of course to this new strategic space called the atmosphere, where we have a lot of focus. So this is one. The second is that when it comes to the knowledge production, this massive knowledge production exercise that we have, I think it would be very useful to ask ourselves in what ways big will contribute to the rethinking of the disciplinary boundaries. Because we're looking at the intersections of border studies, migration studies, and you know that focus is very much there. And we know that one area where, of course, in South Asia and India, we are struggling a lot is the area studies program. So I visualize that one of the major outputs in terms of knowledge production would be the ability of the outcome of this project to force us to, or compel us to rethink and rework out the area studies programs in different parts of the world.
Well, Sanjay, I totally agree. The question is great. The illustration of my answer is we study nationalism. We have a well-known literature. What about nationhood? How is it related conceptually? Show me a book that brings these two literatures and has actually gone beyond. And I've discussed it with Jeff. He's a specialist of nationhood, indigenous claims. He's written on all this for like 20 years. And when I asked him, he said, well, it's not the same. Okay, so we need to work on this. And so my answer is exactly that, you know, on immigration, you just talked on immigration and borders, right? Scott here and Oliver, they contributed to a book, Oliver and a small team, they did a book where they bring the two literatures together, right? Let's do more of this. So that is a way, that's my concrete answer to say, yes, we are actually not challenging, but we're expanding, we're showing how there are connections, how these literatures can speak to each other. We have colleagues who are not interested in these discussions, but we have the luxury of having these complex, you know, a project like, you know, like 21st Century Borders. It gives us the luxury to actually ask those questions and maybe write on these things. So let's do it. Some colleagues are uncomfortable with this. They'd rather stay within their discipline. They'd rather stay, you know, in political science or international studies or geopolitics, and that's okay. But we can do it. A project like this is not one if it's not, you know, interdisciplinary. Like big or even Horizon grants now like 2 to 5 million euros. You cannot win them if your team is not interdisciplinary. They won't even look at it. So that's my answer. Now the spatiality question that, you know, the space issue and the way I look at this, and I don't know how all of you see this, but I think we need to look at very concrete cases. So I'll illustrate this briefly because I had a couple of discussions with Everett and I, you know, with like three officers from each other. And regulatory systems in the private sector, for instance, right now, are kind of and we don't have very many studies on this, right? But if we look at production chains, it's been studied by business, MBA people for a long time. If we put a policy lens and a border lens on this, we have very different perspectives on it, right? So that's my answer. It's like if we take very specific cases, maybe we are going to see things that the literature has never looked at before. It's incomplete, but if we put 40 minds to it, maybe we're going to find some answers there, right? And then again, we have organizations who have, in the partnership, we have organizations who are confronted with these questions continually. And we're ADR, MOD, well custom. So if you help a bit, if you talk to them, you see that sometimes they ask you questions, well, we know the literature, but they're ahead of the literature. They're asking us things that are not discussed yet. Sometimes it's really helpful. Like working with Well Custom on this database issue. So they invited me because you all know I haven't published on it, but for the last 4 years now, we have 60 completed data sets across the 800 plus dyads of the world, 60 data sets, right? And we're working on 30 more. So by the end of the year, we'll have about 90 data sets. And we're starting doing papers. So we've done one workshop with 7 papers, and we're preparing a special issue on this. But soon enough, we're gonna 2-3 more years, and we'll have maybe 150 data sets across all the dyads. So if you have an interest there and you think that maybe looking at data would be a plus, it's very meticulous, it's very slow work. But once you have the data, it's amazing what you can do. Oh, Jeff is here. Wonderful.
You want to go to Jeff?
What's the time? It's 4:30. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
If you had a question, save it, because we should have some time after that, I think.
Let me put Jeff in the screen. Okay, Jeff, can you speak so we know that we can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Excellent.
So let's hold the questions for now, and we go to, because it's 4:30 a.m. and I know it's. I am so glad you're here. So Jeff is the co-director of a research center on indigenous issues called Circle at UVic. He's a full professor. And I mean, I talked to you about him already. He's at UVic, he's my partner for the grant. We thought the grant together for 2 years, and he's the lead for Pillar 1. And we agreed that he's going to talk to you a bit more about Pillar 1 than I did, much more. And then you can ask him questions and have comments and, engage. Jeff, we were just, I was just fielding questions about bridging Pillar 1 and 2, and is it important to stay within the integrity of each pillar, or can we bridge, and how should we bridge? We were at that stage. So
excellent.
Excellent. Right time. So
okay.
Think about, as you said, 20 minutes and then go for it. And then let's have questions and comments with you.
Excellent. Yeah. Wodo, thanks, Emmanuel. Osio Nigata. Hello, everyone. Jeff Ganoholito Corntassel Dagwadoa. My name is Jeff Corntassel. Shalagi Ayetli Guena Sa'i. So I'm from Cherokee Nation. My Cherokee name is Ganoholito. And I'm coming to you from the unceded Lekwungen and Wasanich territories here on the west coast of British Columbia in Victoria. And so it's good to see you all, or hear you all. As Emmanuel mentioned, it's quite early in Victoria, so I'll try to be as coherent as possible. And just really give you a broad introduction to Pillar 1. This is a such an important project and such an important vision that we've shared to really think about ways we can have conversations between Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, across the pillars. And so really COVID has shown us the different responses to borders and to even protected territories and even Indigenous homelands and even waterways. In British Columbia, for example, several First Nations shut down their borders to outside visitors, basically to protect the peoples in their territories, but also to have that space to heal and to be free from the pandemic. And so we think about different ways that Indigenous nations exercise their self-determining authority around the world. And I think really Manuel and I share this vision as really a global vision. We want to get beyond just Turtle Island here, which is kind of what a lot of Indigenous folks talk about in terms of North America. We want to get beyond that. We want to go to the Ainu. We want to go to the experiences of the Adivasi in India. We want to go to those different experiences among the Sami in the northern part of Europe, and we want to talk to the Inuit and other nations in terms of their experiences with borders and with some of these critical issues that are so vital to Indigenous nationhood. We recently presented, Emmanuel and I and a few other of our colleagues presented at it was the inaugural Congress of Nations and States, and it was held in Dublin, Ireland. And very similar experience in the sense that it was very early in the morning that we're presenting. But I think that encapsulates the spirit of that conference encapsulates what we're trying to do with this project, and that the goal of that inaugural conference was to have conversations, deeper conversations between Indigenous nations and even other nations that don't have statehood, with state governments around maybe differing conceptions of borders, differing conceptions of what nationhood entails, different conceptions even around what international entails. And so our conversation was really around the policies of states and how sometimes they conflict. When we think about Indigenous nations, over 70% of the nations in the world today that are without states cross state borders, right? So we think about how those state borders were drawn oftentimes in a colonial way across and with little regard for Indigenous nations. And so, what are the implications policy-wise, but also what are the implications in terms of future resurgence of Indigenous peoples? The 7 areas, I'm going to give you a kind of rundown of the 7 areas broadly that we're covering with Pillar 1. And we have a team of Indigenous scholars that we've been working with. We're just starting to kind of get off the ground with it. And we're growing each day in terms of the different organizations and different possibilities for collaboration that are emerging with groups like the Nationhood Council House and even the Center for World Indigenous Studies, which is run by Rudy Reiser out in the Pacific Northwest. So, these areas include examining new and old trade networks. So Indigenous trade networks, often called out here the Grease Trail, because it followed the Ulukan, which is a very important fish out here, but more importantly, it set up these deeper protocols and these deeper principles for engaging in trade. So what do those trade networks look like today that transcend state borders and that are vital to the future of Indigenous nations and peoples. This kind of segues into the second, broader area around food sovereignty and how food sovereignty is exercised across borders. When we think about salmon, who are such an important part of the food source out here, we could think about things like Quetlal or Camas. We can think about even in my territory or my homeland, we could think about deer, and we could think about other plants and other animals that don't adhere to state boundaries and state borders. And so how is food sovereignty practiced and enacted in meaningful ways by Indigenous nations today, and as part of an extension of their self-determining authority? A third kind of area broader area is new forms of solidarity or treaties. And one of the probably the most prominent examples has been the Buffalo Treaty of 2014, which was signed among Blackfoot nations that were both situated across the US and Canadian border. That was in 2014 that was first signed with 8 signatories, and that now has over 50 signatories. And a lot of these Indigenous nations that have signed on don't necessarily aren't adjacent to the Blackfoot nations, but have similar focus or similar aim to protect and honor that relationship. And so this treaty was formed by Indigenous peoples. States are allowed to be part of it. And so far, no states have signed on to this treaty, but it's really to enhance and basically inform the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with buffalo or bison. And so it's the first of its kind. It's really an important kind of breakthrough in the sense of thinking about treaties with Indigenous nations, and in this case, animal nations. But there are other treaties that are between Indigenous nations, that are between Indigenous peoples and other parts of the world. And so these are some important forms of solidarity that we want to look at throughout the course of this project. A fourth area would be conceptualizing Indigenous nationhood, conceptualizing even, what does self-determination look like in today's context, and even what does international relations look like in this context. And so Emmanuel and I are writing a concept paper that's going to kind of examine the different ways that these terms are taken up, but also to have a dialogue. And this is, for me, this is setting the tone for our collaborations between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, to really have that conversation first about some of the key terms and the ways that we even use these terms of nationhood and self-determination that may differ. And so having these conversations is really important for setting the groundwork for our future work together. Fifth area would be climate action and rights of nature. I don't know if you've heard, and probably some of you are familiar with the rights of nature movement, but the Whanganui River, for example, in 2017 was recognized by the Maori, but also by the state of New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as having distinct rights of legal personhood. And so what do those rights entail when we're talking about transborder relations? Rivers cross boundaries, and mountains and other entities cross boundaries. And also when we think about Indigenous nationhood and assertions of Indigenous self-determination, we can think of Indigenous nations as having their own territorial integrity, their own waterways and homelands that they protect, that also are distinct from the state. And so those are, I often think of any relationship outside of Cherokee Nation, for example, as international. And so even though we're situated within the so-called United States, we're still engaging in international relations anytime we step outside or engage with, state policymakers. And so the rights of nature and climate action, of course, know no boundaries. And that's an important aspect of our work together. A sixth area is indigenous resurgence movements in the face of extractive industries, in the face of other efforts to, in a sense, continue or engage in the colonial project. And so these are the ways in which indigenous peoples challenge those colonial impositions, those colonial forms of violence in everyday ways. And so this is a part of the indigenous internationalism that I've been writing about lately, and that's something that we'll be taking up. And then a seventh and final area, and again, these are just broader areas for consideration for conversation, really, around international legal kind of politics and principles. And so here I'm thinking about mainly the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but we can think of other international legal instruments that are important for considering, especially around border crossings. So Article 36 of UNDRIP, for example, is all about what are the rights of indigenous peoples in whose communities are being bisected or are crossed by borders, and how do those rights ultimately play out on the ground. And I think Emmanuel spoke of the database that's being created by himself and Shukia and others that examine or will examine sort of those dyadic kind of relationships around border crossings, and really examine some of the barriers and hurdles, but also maybe some of the ways in which indigenous nations have asserted their self-determining authority to enact the what's the term I'm looking for, reunification of their families, and to enact free crossing for ceremonies and for other important functions. So I'll close there. I wanted to give plenty of time for questions and other thoughts, but those are some of the things that we're thinking about for Pillar 1, and ways that we're thinking about bridging Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Yeah. Any questions, comments? Yeah, Christian, Dalanje, hello, Christian.
How to make sure Jeff.
You just speak. You speak.
Can you hear me, Jeff? It's Christian.
I can, yeah.
So there's competing assumptions in the propositions that underlie your presentation, right? In terms of self-rule and shared rule, right? So that indigenous, I think, one of the propositions is that indigenous nations make assumptions about self-rule that are not necessarily shared by the modern state in which they are situated. And so part of your project seems to be, how do we reconcile competing assumptions about self-rule within a framework of shared rule? And where do we share those rules? And the reason I bring this up is because there seems to be a lot of talk about sort of indigenous governance and borders and so forth. But what we've forgotten about is that there's, of course, literature dating back 20 years or more about non-territorial federalism and governance structures that we've learned about in terms of from federal arrangements that we've applied in non-territorial capacities. And to some extent, I think there's a lot of important work, what also Cheryl Lightfoot and so forth are doing on this. At the same time, I think I worry a bit to what extent we're reinventing some of the wheels that had already been solved from a governance perspective in sort of this non-territorial federal and multi-level governance frameworks. And so to what extent do you see the project that you are proposing departing from and innovating on that literature? And to what extent do you also see the project you're proposing helping us to reconcile what are these fundamentally different assumptions about self-rule and sovereignty within a new framework of shared rule?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, yeah, I've been involved in that literature for the last 30 years. And so I am familiar with it and, you know, I've done some of that work. So it's not new to me. And I don't think the rule has been shared in quite the way that has benefited Indigenous peoples or nations. And so I don't think this has been resolved by any stretch, even with the literature, even with the, you know, some of the work that's out there. So I don't pretend to think that we can resolve this with our project. And, you know, we have, what we're doing is really positioning ourselves from the standpoint of Indigenous nations, Indigenous communities, in terms of the very real and daily lived realities that we're confronting, you know, on the border, that we're confronting on our territories. And we're not, in this sense, we're not, you know, we're pre-state entities, and we're, you know, we've, you know, Cherokee Nation, for example, has existed for 10,000 years or more. And, you know, you could have, you know, several other, you know, the 5,000 to 7,000 Indigenous peoples and nations, you know, distinct Indigenous nations across the world, you know, in over 77 different countries are really the models for self-determination. And so, you know, for each of those federal arrangements, or for each of those forms of shared rule, there's stories around it's, and I don't confine self-determination to self-rule, in the sense that it's more than just self-governance. It's the broader exercise of those ultimate, you know, I would say inherent rights and responsibilities that we have around trade, that we have around food sovereignty, that we have around even, you know, the revitalization of our languages, you know, our ceremonial lives, all of those things. And so, yeah, I think this pillar is really just an invitation to that conversation. We're not going to, you know, we're building on other works, certainly, that have gone before, but we're not trying to, and in that sense, we're not trying to reinvent anything, but we're also forging different areas that haven't been addressed by the literature around these very distinct areas, such as climate change, right? You know, how have forms of multi-level governance addressed climate change in a meaningful way, especially in terms of prioritizing Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledge systems. So those are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in addressing with our group, but also across the pillars. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm glad that you mentioned Adivasis of India. You know, and if you look at the state narrative, the state believe that there's nothing like indigenous community in India. It's a post-colonial country. So because you are working on it, and also because there's a lot of protest from the side of the state, there's a strong resistance from the Indian state not to consider these people as an indigenous people, because there's nothing like indigenous community in a country like India. That's the position. How appropriate it is to study with the same lens that you are studying, or do we need a different kind of a lens to study the indigenous community in such a state like India, where there is a lot of, resistance, there's a lot of force, even on a scholar, not to use such a term.
Yeah, thank you. I think I picked up most of that. I lost you a little bit, but for us, it's really, to give voice and to amplify some of these perspectives, these indigenous perspectives from around the world. So I think you're right. I think there's always points of comparison, but we don't want to make something kind of universalized or, approach it from a very narrow lens. So I think it would be really important to look at maybe particular case studies in the case of Adivasis. And I've always been, I know so little about some of the struggles there, but I do know, enough about, how that's been a challenge even around who is indigenous. And that continues throughout, especially around places like Thailand, for example, Myanmar, aka Burma, right, where those questions remain in terms of, even indigeneity is denied oftentimes by those host states. And so I think it'd be, it'd be the kind of conversation that we would have with Adivasis, with peoples from the territory, and really to have them share their perspective on their own terms. And so whatever that looks like, it might be, some sort of research collaboration. It might be, it might be a project. It might be a film, like we can get creative, might be a podcast. But to really dig deeper in terms of, what are some of the struggles that Adivasis have, and what are some things that we can draw from those struggles to really understand or better understand what self-determination looks like for them.
Super. And we do have money for movies if we want to, right, in the grant. I put 50K and I partnered with an organization that could do this, so we could definitely do this. I think the third hand was Anwar. Speak up, Anwar.
Yeah, I have two sets of questions. One to follow up the questions that were asked just before you got online. So one of them was, what about multidisciplinarity? And you started answering, but I would like to ask questions about national methodology, or the way that we always focus on defining borders through a literature that comes from our own country or from a state perspective, like nations defined by the state. So how far do we go into this pillar one, into a conceptual discussion of what borders mean for non-state actors or people or groups like indigenous groups that have a different notion of what limits between different groups of people may be? And this is something we already discussed, but I think maybe this is timely now, big to discuss also literature on borders in India and everywhere around the world, and have this very post-colonial approach to what it would be to define a border today. Okay, it's territorial, non-territorial, but what does it mean to be territorial, non-territorial, according to where you focus it from? So that's what my first set of questions. My second will be shorter. I was wondering if there would be space within this first pillar to consider no borders movement struggles against borders, not necessarily from indigenous people, but this notion of contesting and struggling against borders, which is some research that I've been engaging into right now. That's it.
Excellent. Yeah. What? Thanks for that. So I think the first question, if I got that right, is the nature of kind of the interdisciplinary approaches that we can take to better understanding what borders might mean to indigenous nations and to indigenous peoples. And I think if I got that right. I think the way that we're approaching this is really from, the standpoint or the perspective of Indigenous peoples themselves. And so there is room for that conversation around even that can help inform our methodology. A methodology, for example, of storytelling would be important for bringing out those stories, bringing out those experiences of Indigenous peoples as they have those, at times confrontations with border crossing agents, having different experiences with denial of entry into your own territory, all of those things. So yeah, I think this is definitely an interdisciplinary approach. That's the way I approach this as well, and in my work. And so if I got your question right, I think that's the way I would respond to that. And then absolutely, I think we're also looking at ways. We have a partnership with Pacific Peoples Partnership. It's a little bit hard to say, but we have partnerships with other groups that are not necessarily Indigenous in their perspectives, but have unique perspectives. So we're looking at different forms of solidarity, for example, with LGBTQ plus communities, people of color, different collectives that have emerged in response to the regulation of bodies. And so this is also a gendered question, right? That in terms of how, what does body sovereignty look like in border crossing? And so absolutely, we're going to look at new forms of, or new aspects of solidarity that have occurred with Indigenous peoples and other groups, and maybe forms of solidarity that haven't included necessarily Indigenous peoples as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Any other comments or questions, anybody to Jeff? Heather?
Hi, Jeff, it's Heather Nickel, and I just wanted to thank you for your comments and to say, and I'll talk about this more when I talk, but one of the things we haven't looked at really seriously is the role of formal education in all of this, and I think I'd like to raise that issue because, as well as I do, that a lot of the questions that we're asking now come from challenges to research methodologies and all kinds of things and different ways of doing research and then different ways of teaching and learning and mobilizing knowledge. And I think that that's a really important gap in this kind of work. And I think that looking at the way in which knowledge is produced and circulated within post-secondary institutions is huge. So and I think you touched on that, and I just wanted to sort of underscore that and support you on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, really, I think Emmanuel and I think all of you in this room probably share a similar commitment to making this work accessible and to really ensuring that these voices are prominent in the work. So it's not just limited to another journal article, for example. Those are important, and certainly, edited volumes are important, but something that Emmanuel and I talked about early on is, we really need some new forms, or, some of these are old forms, but new ways of conveying some of these research findings that aren't exclusive to the written word. So, we have a podcast, for example. We have film, a filmmaker that we're going to engage with. And we could think of different, even different kinds of meetings that we could hold, that will be conversational. And so that's kind of the goal that I have, is to really, broaden the conversation so that it is inclusive, and so it's not confined to these institutions. So I hope that addresses what you're getting
Yeah,
at.
well, I also think the study of the transmission of knowledge and education itself, like Jacinta has one model, and then you've got UArctic, and those sorts of things, actually looking at how that contributes to, ethno-nationalisms and
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And, really understanding how, who are the scholars. There's a collective called the Red Nation, for example, that has they've put forward a kind of a Red New Deal, which is kind of an indigenous manifesto. And that comes a lot from the work of the late Vine Deloria Jr., but it also comes a lot from Marx and from other folks. So I think, yeah, absolutely. I think I love that idea of really looking at who are the people that are being embraced, whether it's Glenn Coulthard or Vine Deloria Jr., who are the people that are being kind of embraced and picked up on in terms of their scholarship, and how is that motivating maybe new forms for mobilizing Indigenous peoples. So yeah, that's a great point.
Well, Jeff, you've been amazingly articulate for 4 a.m.
Yeah, that's well, thank you.
Good job.
I think we could take one more.
Oh, is there another question? Sure. One last question for Jeff.
Can I just, Jeff, it was a great presentation. Given that land rights have always been at the heart of indigenous people struggles all over the world, right? And one of the reasons as to why the Indian state is so reluctant legally, geopolitically, what is being called the public land, public space. If you have the assertion of First Nations rights, Adivasi Gandhi called these people, they have been there since times immemorial. So my question is, methodologically, theoretically, and empirically, how do we capture the question of land rights and its intersection with the indigenous people's struggles in different parts of the world, given the overarching context of neoliberal globalization, which probably is going to stay, into the rest of the future ahead? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. In a way, if I summed up my entire approach, it would be, what about the land? What about our, how is nationhood intricately tied or interrelated to basically relationships to the land and to the waters? That's at the core of what I think we're doing here, is really looking at times competing claims for land. This is where with the earlier question around, federalist kinds of arrangements. Sometimes these are great in principle, but it leads to competing claims and maybe in some cases a challenge, right, to different municipal governments, for example. What rights do they have in terms of a say over what happens on Cherokee territory, for example. So yeah, this is at the heart of what we're doing, I would say, and it's kind of underlying all of the work in terms of having different conceptualizations even of what is your relationship to the land versus rights. So thinking about rights and responsibilities as two parts of maybe a spectrum, and how do these things overlap, and how do these things also lead us to new insights about shared territories. So yeah, I think this is the legacy, the ongoing legacy of colonization, which is always involved land, right? And so if we're talking about decolonizing principles, if we're talking about self-determining authority, we have to get back to the land and the water in some form or fashion. And so, yeah, I think I don't have any easy answers. I think you'd be suspicious, rightly suspicious if I did, but we're going to look to different governing arrangements. We're going to look to different ways in which Indigenous nations are exerting their self-determining authority around the world. And it all comes back down to the land. So thank you for that. Wado.
Okay, Jeff, we are going to, I want you to see me. I don't know. Can you see me if I come here?
Can you talk the camera? Will?
Jeff, we're gonna stop the session that you and I led now. I don't know if you see me this way.
I don't see you, but I see your hand. I saw your hand briefly.
I come here, can you see me? I don't know, I vanished anyway. We see you extremely well because you're on two screens. One a big screen in front of all of us. There you go.
Oh, there you are.
Right? Can you see that? Thank you. Anyway, so we're going to take a 3 minutes break, and then we have the first panel that is led, by the team on security. If you look at the program, you see the details. You can stay, but we're going to take a few minutes break. If you don't want to stay, thank you so much for coming. I think it's very successful, and I think it's very clear. And we'll have a chance to, discuss more the concrete partnership with, whoever has an interest in this will probably write you and get in touch and see how we can, expand the team on Pillar 1 and also the relationship between Pillar 1 and 2 when people are interested in working across the two.
Can I just
Do you want to say a few more words and then we close the session, please? I guess he doesn't hear.
Manuel, just a technical now. I just got another message from Eilat. She says, you've got to be outside at 4:30.
We will be outside. Take it easy. Okay, Jeff. Bye-bye.
All right, Wado, thank you. Thank you all.
So 5-minute break.
We take a 5-minute break and then we have an hour and 15 minutes for the panel.
She didn't rush.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
Let's take a break. Jackie regarde pas cette différence. C'est ça qu'il a fait. Tu l'as entendu?
Hey, how are you? I didn't even recognize your hair.
Ça, c'est très intelligent. Ça, c'est moi. Ça, c'est l'idée originale. Je lui dis, we collect data on them because they have, so we make them. Tu lui en parles et tu lui dis voilà comment est-ce qu'il a le réseau, où est-ce que tu cherches le réseau.
Je trouve que ça serait important de dire que, en nous, je me suis posé la question pour les parlants, c'est est-ce que c'est dangereux de poser des questions autochtones?
On va en aurait besoin de plus de temps.
Oui, ça, je trouvais que c'était important.
Christian, are you guys going to be okay?
C'est ça, vous buvez pas, hein?
Only time will tell.
T'as compris, là? C'est trop long, vous buvez pas.
You can also connect with Zoom. And then
Ah oui,
progress
she
your
said you were
computer.
gonna-
I don't know if you can have Zoom. I think you could connect on Zoom.
Okay, good.
And if we need help, maybe. Perfect. Can you guys not connect with your laptop?
Be a timekeeper. Well, I think the most,
Use mine?
the most valuable items might be a brief discussion perhaps at the end of each presentation for both you and Manuel. I think
I'm tired.
what are you hearing? Then maybe also a bit of a.
It's okay.
Oh, yeah, no.
So maybe after all.
Victoria, so much further just going across.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding there. It's all good. Yes.
Emmanuel? Why don't we do this? We'll go through the presentations. Provide sort of some discussion and reflections on what you heard.
Yes.
And then we'll open it up for broader discussion.
Yes.
Both as a feedback mechanism for us, like where we align, and where we sort of.
So are you from Delhi? Where are you?
You're welcome. I know, I'm delighted that you invited our leader. Oh, that's all I do. I am so happy. Here, just take a seat.
Okay.
I'm so happy.
Okay. Well, I was very worried about the. Okay.
No,
Tu vas bien?
Oui, ça va et toi?
oui.
J'ai une pandémie plus tard, mais.
C'est ça, on est là.
Okay.
Mais ça va, ton
Thank you,
laboratoire?
thank you. I was reading the message. Because I didn't realize
I know, it's just that, the first 2 hours.
Voilà.
Tu as eu une université dans le laboratoire, donc tu as regagné.
5 ans. 5 années de ma vie.
All these people have want to work with us.
Non, c'est pas
Pour
un
le
sacrifice.
bien-être, ça commence.
C'est pas un sacrifice. J'ai trouvé que. J'ai rien gagné de l'argent. C'est des choses. What was that?
I have one other one. That's it. I think I only have 2. I think you're sharing. I just saw.
C'est des
I think I just saw it.
Avoir sur le plan de succès, ça
Et on a fait.
There won't be very many people left.
Ils sont à l'envers.
Well, I just looked at my before.
C'est que en fait, les personnes véganes étaient
But it
égalité pour gagner.
can't they get in there? Hey.
Difficile à faire. Sauf la Suisse. Son égalité. Et toutes les personnes qui sont nous, on a besoin que d'un candidat. C'est comme ça qu'on a fait. That's funny. He said, well, I was
Yeah.
very clear.
Ça a très bien marché. Voilà. Mais comme j'ai fait la direction du laboratoire, j'étais très en retard avec le projet personnel. C'est la traduction.
You're gonna use your time. We gotta start.
Everybody take this.
Maintenant, le livre est traduit.
Can we get your panel up here? Lori?
Won't be down there in time.
No, that's right.
Where's James?
Funny when we were diving, actually everywhere we went, people were speaking Arabic. I know, I feel like I'm getting yelled at again in here.
Have the seat, you gotta start.
Jamie.
Christian, who's going first?
Does everybody have their PowerPoint up there?
Yeah, they're all up. She's got them all. 15 minutes, is that right?
Well, if we do 15 minutes, then we're too long.
We got like 3 or 4.
Well, if you want to be out of here by,
Okay, I can do 10 minutes.
if you want to be 20 after 4, then we have like,
So who's first?
7, 8 minutes sort of.
We're not the only panel.
Yeah, yeah, we're at. So 10 minutes?
We can do less than 10 minutes, so we actually have some time for discussion,
Okay,
so.
less than cut out. Yep.
So, well, because we basically have 60 minutes
I
now,
forgot this one, but there's.
right? So if everybody does 10 minutes, if
Yeah, 5 of us, so.
everybody does 10 minutes and we have reactions
Okay,
by
I'm
both
just gonna
hands
stand up
and
then.
then
So
that's
just
the time.
5 of us.
Seven to 8 minutes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I didn't have hers. She wasn't in the room when I was loading up hers. Okay, well, are you gonna keep time or? It's okay. Somebody just give me a 2 minute. On y va. Yoga. It's his humor, you know, he's always like this. This is Is there a clicker or should I come over here?
Or can it be on here?
What order we, let's just stick with the order that we have.
I'm last.
You're last?
Yeah, I don't care if I don't know.
I don't know.
Then I'll go last, so I'll go after everyone else.
Really? Usually. You want?
Well, because I can edit.
I could easily cut out things too.
Because I only.
Yeah, I can take 4 minutes.
I don't need 8, I'll take 4.
I can take 4, but.
I'm gonna take 20.
How long has it got?
An hour, okay. There's 5 of us.
Oh, that's it, all right.
That's my
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Yeah, less than.
Okay, let's begin, everyone. Lori Troutman, Western Washington University Border Policy Research Institute.
All right, I'll take it away. Thanks everybody for sticking around. I only have 8 minutes, I was told, so I'm gonna have to speak a little fast and I might skip a couple slides, but I'm just gonna kind of lay out a few projects that my institute is doing for Borders and Globalization. We're somewhat of a unique institute in that we are housed at a university, but we're not doing sort of traditional academic research. We're doing applied border policy work, working a lot with Customs and Border Protection, Canada Border Services Agency, and other really regional actors in the British Columbia, Washington State region that straddles the Canada-US border. So I have some slides to give you an idea of the region, but given how little time we have, I think I'm going to sort of skip many of those and just get right to sort of the cross-border nature of this region that's Western Washington and Western British Columbia. So we have a lot of ports of entry here. We have 5 land border crossings. We're connected by 3 ferry routes. We have a rail line, and we have multiple flight paths. So all in all, we see about 12 million trips from British Columbia into this region every year. And that makes us the 3rd busiest passenger crossing on the Canada-US border. And we move about $18 billion of goods through the land border. So really the point here is just that we have a lot of different connections that really knit the region together. And walking through just a few of those linkages, we have very integrated supply chains. We trade in mineral fuels. We have an aerospace industry that I believe has built the first electric seaplane in the world, which is a very cool thing. We have a tech sector that straddles the border between Vancouver and Seattle. Microsoft and Amazon have offices on both sides of the border, so that really sort of creates a labor market in innovation and tech. And we also have a borderland economy that's very much driven by Canadians coming into the US. This is for tourism, this is for same-day shopping. The town that I live in has an airport that caters very much to Canadians to come down to the US and fly out of a US airport to have domestic flights. And we also have a lot of Canadians buying homes on the US side of the border. And we also have a really strong network of families and friends and dual citizens that straddle the border. And some of you have heard of the Peace Arch Park. This is a picture down here of a wedding that happened during the COVID border restrictions. This park was the only place in North America where US citizens and Canadians could be together without actually crossing the border during the border restrictions and COVID. So people came from all over both countries to be together with their loved ones and their friends. And we're very proud of sort of that spirit of connection and collaboration that we have in this Cascadia region. So I'm just going to walk through 3 projects. The first one I'll go into a little bit more detail because this is one that we've started. And then the second 2 are ones that we propose to do as part of our Borders and Globalization contract. And we're sort of still thinking through what the exact parameters of those will be. So the first one is looking at transboundary natural disaster management. In our region and in many other regions, we've seen a huge increase in climate-induced natural disasters that of course span borders. We have increased forest fires that really affects air quality on both sides of the border. We've had flooding, we've had these sort of heat dome things, they're called, where we have a very elevated amount of temperature hitting us in the summertime. Usually we stay quite cool, but we've been seeing temperatures that are very high and people have died as a result. So this research, the objectives of this research are to identify what are the transboundary hazards in the region, who are the actors involved in transboundary disaster prevention, response, and recovery, and what are the legal frameworks that govern disaster prevention, response, and recovery. And our goal here is really to develop a public data bank and information hub on transboundary hazards and natural response. And this is a really challenging thing to do in the cross-border environment. Many of you obviously are aware of this, but in BC and in Washington, we see a lot of maps like this where we might be mapping seismic hazards. Obviously, they don't stop at the border, but the map does. This is a map of a flooding situation I'll get a little more into in the next slide. Obviously, the floods don't stop at the border, but the map does. So the challenges here largely are around data collection and modeling, but also around funding. One government entity doesn't want to fund activities necessarily that might benefit the other side. The capacity for many of us who engage in this work, we have our day jobs, and then oftentimes collaborating across the border is sort of an additional add-on that a lot of people just don't have the capacity for And then, of course, there's the added degree of coordination, even in a region like this where you have two democratic governments, two English-speaking peoples, there's still a lot of challenges around coordination. One example is that we have different fiscal years. So the Canadian fiscal year ends at a different time than the US one, and that creates some mundane but real challenges. And then, of course, politics. There's always politics. So the one example I wanted to show you was the flooding of the Nooksack River. So this is a major river that drains a mountain region, and it takes the water all the way down into the bay. And this map was actually one that I had asked some students to create. I said, can you just create a map that shows where this river floods, which you think would be a fairly easy thing to do. But it turns out that Canada doesn't actually have a flood map for this river because it's in the US. But what happens is, you guys, when the river floods, it actually goes up north all the way across the border. So the city of Abbotsford here had a flood map, but the federal government and the provincial government didn't. So this highlights a lot of the challenges around trying to coordinate modeling and disaster response to a river that might be located in the US side, but spills its banks into Canada. And this is a major, major issue. A lot of flooding has happened here. About a year and a half ago, you can see this is towns in Canada on the both US and the Canadian side. And I pulled this quote out actually from the planning document around this. Everything good?
Are you okay with virtual stuff? Do you need someone still to come and help?
No, we're good.
We're okay.
Okay. Preventing all overflows is not likely to be politically feasible because in this case, you have a situation where the US would have to prevent the overflow by allowing the water or by creating a dike so the water doesn't spill its banks and go into Canada. But if the US did that, all that water would go downstream and flood US communities even more. So there's the politics involved in how to manage this on both sides of the border. The second project that we're just sort of beginning to think about is the 2026 FIFA World Cup, which is coming to Vancouver and Seattle. So how can we facilitate cross-border travel, promote collaboration, and leverage these games to advance border policy? So in 2010, when the Vancouver Olympics were held, we saw sort of a major leap in border policy approaches. Matt was involved in that, the creation of a new border crossing document. So how can we sort of pilot some of these ideas, leveraging this huge global event to potentially advance border policy and mobility in general? So the idea of tourism and having a two-nation vacation, people who are able to travel to the US and Canada to attend these games somewhat seamlessly. Lots of border issues that are going to arise. We saw this during the COVID border restrictions where Canada had one set of rules, the US had another, and the average traveler trying to navigate those going back and forth had no actual resources to tell them what they needed to do in both directions. So we're hoping to be able to develop that resource, work with both governments so that there's a little bit more holistic approach to cross-border mobility. And I just wanted to point out that Seattle and Vancouver are the only sort of sister cities where the World Cup games are going to be played in North America. So we are going to have some unique challenges, but I think also really unique opportunities to collaborate and facilitate those games. And then the last one is assessing kind of the state of cross-border relational infrastructure between British Columbia and Washington State. So looking at what's the current institutional framework that we have between agencies on both sides. Where are the gaps? Where's the non-alignment? What entities are involved in different mandates? Who are the actors in the different jurisdictions? And what is a better institutional framework? So to sum this up very quickly, because I don't have much time, in the British Columbia government, there is an entity that is tasked with intergovernmental relations, and there's an elected official who is also tasked with being the liaison for Washington State. Now, if that person has an issue that they want to reach across the border to Washington State, there's actually no counterpart there. So there's this huge misalignment. So our governor's office is looking at, could we create in Washington State an entity so that we would actually have, sort of equilibrium between the state and the province. And so for two entities that work together a lot, that have a lot of mutual goals, it's sort of surprising sometimes how misaligned we are in our agencies. So our goal is to create perhaps a mapping or a network analysis where we can identify where those gaps are and hopefully improve those connections. So I think that's it for me. It's by 8 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, you can't see it on there. You have to look back here.
Yeah.
Mine didn't move.
Hi, I'm Todd Hadley. I'm going to talk about border self-determination and security. I think my project is fairly rooted in Pillar 1 with some cross-section into Pillar 2 in the security aspect. I'm traditionally a security scholar, but I've moved into Indigenous studies and mostly with regards to policing and indigeneity in the last couple of years. When I was preparing for this little talk, I thought about a particular case study in Canada. This is the what's called the Akwesasne Mohawk Territory, and it spans the Canada-US border between Toronto and Montreal, closer to the Montreal side. The Canada-US border goes right through the Mohawk Territory. The title at the front, "A Hole in the Border," comes from a 2001 news article in the National Post that asked the question whether or not this was a hole in the border. And I think what it really did to me was to illustrate how far we've gone in understanding our relationship with sovereign Indigenous territories, but it also struck me as we really didn't have it right to think that we didn't have a relationship with these sovereign regions that we should have had 20 years ago. So I thought immediately of that particular case study or that particular story when I was preparing for the lecture. So what do we want to do in Pillar 1 when we look at settler, non-settler borders? I've laid out 5 goals here. And I really wish Jeff could be here to comment on this because he made some really good comments. And I think a lot of my presentation is going to parallel some of the stuff that Jeff is saying, and that we're really just starting a discussion about some of the really contestable terms. And we look at what these terms mean from an Indigenous perspective and what they mean from a non-settler and a settler perspective. So we want to investigate implications for border security and policy management across regions of settler and non-settler borders. When I talk about settler borders, sometimes they use the term colonial borders, sometimes use the term Westphalian borders. They're really the borders that were superimposed over non-settler regions within colonial territories. So you think about the Canada-US border being imposed in North America, the US-Mexico border being imposed across non-colonial lands or Indigenous lands. We want to compare approach to border security where settler borders and non-settler borders intersect. And I think this is going to be a real challenge because in some regions of the world, there is actually policy in place to work together with Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities to work out policy plans for security and border security that respect the sovereignty of Indigenous territories. We want to understand considerations, starting with whose security are we talking about? And again, this is one of those contestable terms, and I'll get to that in a bit. Articulate drivers of security policy where settler and non-settler borders intersect. What drives that policy in Canada? The US is going to be very different than US-Mexico or from the case study in India, for example. Finally, you want to look at the political, social, and cultural conditions that frame security policy at levels of cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. And Christian's going to talk more about that CCC model in his presentation, I believe, right? Yeah. So he can come back to that. Now, there's a number of things that we want to consider when we're doing this research. And this is where Jeff and I would really agree that this raises a lot more questions than it does answers when we start conducting this research. Some of the things I want to talk about briefly is the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I want to talk about the idea of borders. What do borders mean in settler terms? What do they mean in non-settler terms? Whose security are we talking about? We're talking about the security of the state. We're talking about the security of the sovereign people who live within those Indigenous territories. What exactly are we talking about? The idea of sovereignty and nation. And finally, some of the epistemological considerations, because knowledge is built very differently amongst different communities. I want to start by just briefly looking at Article 36 of the UNDRIP. And Jeff mentioned Article 36, which gives the right for Indigenous persons to move across international boundaries for the spiritual, cultural, political, economic, social purposes. It's an embedded right within UNDRIP. But I think what Jeff didn't mention was Articles 3 and 4, which gives Indigenous persons the right to self-determination. And I think what's really important here is in internal and local affairs. How do we define borders in Indigenous communities? Are these internal? I would argue yes, that those borders are the property of Indigenous communities, and they have the right to manage those borders. How they manage those borders with the state, for lack of a better term, is kind of what we want to explore and get to. What does that management look like? Settler and non-settler borders, of course, this is again another contestable term. What do we mean? Someone who is a settler scholar, I have a certain understanding of what borders are, but a non-settler border is going to be understood in a completely different way. And we've superimposed these settler borders on non-settler borders, and there's a contestation with where these meet. So it kind of sets the stage for lack of a better word, a need for a new governance model between two, sometimes more sovereign groups. Think about the Canada-US border, for example. It's not just Canada and the United States, but now we're talking about different sovereign nations that also need to be included in that discussion on how we build security along that border. It's no longer the state imposing, or it shouldn't be the state imposing what happens. Whose security are we talking about? We can think about security as sets of policies and materials and actions that ensure certain goals and certain values within communities that are preserved. But what communities do we talk about? During COVID, well, I won't get into the COVID discussion, this will take too long. But the point here is, whose values and goals are we talking about? Are we talking about that of the settler state or the non-settler state? And whose should they be? Again, it's a discussion that has to be had and understood. Epistemological considerations, knowledge is created differently. And there's no such thing as a pan-Indigenous epistemology. Every single case study has to be done and worked with on an individual basis to be understood. And I think that's a really important piece. And Jeff talked about this idea of storytelling and the importance of storytelling. This leads to methodological considerations that we have to take into account when we're doing the research with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Last slide, there's various ways to divide the globe. Here's a picture. If we divided it up using Indigenous borders, the globe would look very different than it looks today. So we have to keep this in mind, that there's different ways of dividing space and understanding those relationships between these groups that belong to this territory and these groups that are newcomers to the territory. And that's it. I hope I was under 8 minutes.
Just under.
Speed presenting. It's like, sounds like you have to get paid.
Oh, how to get out of here?
Yeah. Where's your show? There we go. Which is mine.
Makes sense.
Okay, got it. Oh, it's not showing up on the screen. Oh, man, I had 3 slides I didn't even use. All right, yeah, we get.
I know, I was gonna set the stage, I was gonna, get into the.
It's happened to our screen.
Oh.
Okay, well, you know what, I'm all talk. So let's not worry about the PowerPoint, the screen. Well, I need to read it, so, okay, so I'm gonna try in the remaining 7 minutes that I have left, talk.
Just so we can see the.
Okay, there we are. I'm gonna try to 7 minutes talk about the 2 projects that I'm involved in doing. This is not, the Territorial North is what the title was given. But it's not the Territorial North. The Territorial North is the Canadian, the territories, and this is actually circle polar. So just bear that in mind. And what I'm starting from is a premise that I mentioned to Jeff, is the importance of sort of education both in terms of building cooperation in transnational spaces, and education in terms of promoting cultural revitalization, resilience, resurgence, and the implications that has on challenges to territory and the sort of shoring up of territorial integrity in other cases, and ethno-nationalism as well, the way that people like Paul and Anstey have defined it, as well as Jeff. And so I want to pitch the first one I want to talk to you about is our project on I'm going to just skip all that. Non-state actors and circumpolar regionalization. a UArctic case study. And this project stems from some of the work that I've done and some of the involvement a number of us have had in the University of the Arctic, which is an institutional network to promote circumpolar and to regionalize institutional cooperation in the circumpolar region and support the development of curriculum and thematic networks. It involves about 196, no more than that now, about 200 institutions, many of them in the circumpolar north, but many also in the south. So there's a breaching of a transcendence of a border. It involves about 6 or so thematic networks, and it also involves a number of different institutes among these institutes. One of the institutes is the UArctic Lara Institute for Circumpolar Studies. So what we're basically looking at is we're examining how Indigenous awareness and resurgence and new politics of nationhood and nationalism are affecting, fragmenting, and redrafting intergovernmental relationships inside states, as reflected in the regionalization of post-secondary Arctic education, organized through the UArctic and the Northern Forum and other similar regionalized forums. How and where does UArctic intersect with state and non-state definitions of nationality and sovereign interest? I don't have to say too much, I don't think, on that. Whoops. We went to that. I'm not going to say too much on that because I'm going to speak about that. The UArctic is a non-state actor, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems and the connectivity and some of the things that we're going to look at in this study. But what I would say right now is we're going to look at UArctic both in the context of larger institutional cooperation. What has it been tasked with through organizations like the Arctic Council, which my colleague Daly has written about in context of borders. But we're also going to think about what is its role and how has it affected incorporation or promoted incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous learning, and Indigenous education more broadly. Has it or has it not, and what can we do to promote that? So I'm going to not say too much more about that right now. What I am going to pitch is another more focused case study that we're also looking at in this project, consistent with the broader pieces of understanding the role of education in Indigenous survivance and resurgence. And we're going to look at this particular piece. Now, the last thing I should say is it's been sort of put as a pillar 2 perspective. Pillar 2 is the Indigenous perspective, yeah. But we also think that it crosses both pillar 1 and pillar 2, and we could talk about reasons for that later. But again, some of the things I mentioned to Jeff. So I would argue education is infrastructure, knowledge infrastructures. It involves mobilization of students, mobilization of knowledge, different policies put in place by national governments, which actually may or may not, may contradict with the larger policies of the Arctic or may promote different outcomes. So I think there's that piece there. Now, the second one, back to that, is non-state actors and circumpolar regionalization to Sami cultural and political nationalism. And one of the priorities of this, or the premises of this research project, is that self-determination and nationalist movements pose internal regulatory policy challenges to states. And we're going to use the Sami as a case study of this. As you well know, the Sami homeland, or Sapmi, is really incorporates Norway, Finland, and Sweden. And this is, at least in this particular case study, this is what we're looking at. And what we're trying to do is understand the impact of Sami education on a sense of Sami sort of cultural revival, a sense of Sami nationalism, and the way in which the individual Sami nationalisms within each of these 3 states have moved together to shape, or have they moved together to shape something more broadly, and how this actually impacts the definition and understanding of Sami homeland itself. And I would like to say that it's not something, I'm not a Sami scholar, and our point isn't to go and do the research on the ground as much as to use the Eilat Academy which is an existing forum for discussion and cooperation within the Northern Nordic nations. It's a moving conference, basically, that travels across. It used to go to Russia, but last year we didn't. But every year it goes across the Nordic areas, Sweden, Finland, Norway, visits different communities, talks to different groups of people, and in doing so talks to Sami educators, goes to places like Inari, the Sami capital, where there are a number of, in Finland, where there are a number of different Sami institutions, secondary and post-secondary in place, actually. Below that as well, more elementary and primary school education. And we're going to talk to folks and try to get in this discussion, identify and pull together a sense of how scholars are thinking about these issues, how Sami leadership is thinking about these issues. And we'll workshop that, just as we are doing here today, we'll workshop that through a couple of different events at the Eilat Academy. I know that's too small to read, but it's just there for my script. And we'll also workshop it through the thematic network for geopolitics and security. It fits, believe me, of the U-Arctic, and we'll have a number of different workshops in Iceland at the Arctic Circle and at several other thematic network meetings that are fostered by U-Arctic. So it's all sort of almost essentially interrelated, the U-Arctic and our understanding of education, but we're using our U-Arctic network, we're using our Eilat Academy network, we're using existing understandings, and we'll be talking to people and requesting input from across this, the Eilat region, as we will for the U-Arctic. And we'll be collaborating with people like Daly, who's written that book that on borders that Dwayne and I did. We're collaborating and trying to really pull something out of this piece, because I think education and curriculum and cooperation in that area has been really overlooked in how it shapes regional territories and borders. So I've probably taken more than my 8 minutes.
Just did it.
Cursor's disappeared. That's okay.
It appears on the screen.
What's going on? I didn't move when I-
So we get a sense of some of the questions that we're asking. I hope we get a sense of how this feeds into the two pillars and how we're trying to bridge those pillars, how we're trying to break out of methodological nationalism. We can see some of the diversity here in terms of disciplines, geography, political science, sociology that you're going to get in a moment. The countries that you're going to hear about, the multiple continents here. If you think about Canada, the United States, Australia, these are all federal countries, of course, and the sub-state elements. As you hear sort of about Canada, US, Australia, there's also a sense of sort of Anglosphere, so the common belonging, but to what extent are cultural determinants important or not for the people who don't work across borders. Also a sense, hopefully, if as you're starting to think about this from a security perspective, trying to break out of the traditional sort of kinetic way of thinking about security and thinking about sort of these challenges of environmental security and challenges that environmental climate change brings, human security and food security. When we're talking about the North, this Heather will always remind us that sort of these very much endogenous effects about how we think about the challenges that we face. So sort of a quick summary of sort of how this connects with big 1.0 and 2.0, and you'll get reactions to everything we hear from Emmanuel and from Matt, and then we're interested in all of your critiques of what we just kind of told you in terms of how we can do what we're doing better. So a special issue that Todd and I co-edited, where we're starting to ask more fundamental methodological questions about how do we actually study this cross-border collaboration, and I think it's interesting that a special issue that appeared only 4 years ago is consistently in the top 10 most downloaded pieces in the Journal of Borderland Studies. So I think that tells us something about the interest in also methods of what we actually study, and the different elements that you see below there in terms of some of the determinants, some of the metrics that we can actually try to measure here. The forthcoming book that Emmanuel had already mentioned about governance dimensions of security cooperation, and this brings us to what in the program you heard to refer to as the open border paradox, and people often assume, well, sort of open borders are just kind of open borders precisely because governments sort of step back from their borders, and it actually turns out that the exact opposite is true. That open borders are open borders because they're well managed, they're well governed, and they're well administered borders. That in a democracy, the faith that people have in their democratic institutions very much hinges on the ability of the impression that they have of their governments to be able to manage those borders and to manage those borders effectively. And of course, everything between anthropogenic and naturogenic challenges, if we sort of project this ahead over the next 10, 20, 30 years, there's very significant challenges coming. Everything from the increase in world population to somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people. So in the next sort of 30 years, we'll have roughly another 3 billion people on the planet. Most of these people are going to be born in areas that are very significantly, have very weak institutions and state capacity, are significantly affected by climate change, climate security sort of aspects. So how do we actually manage this in a constructive fashion? My approach to that is always like, if we look at Canada, the United States, our relationship with our closest partners across the Pacific and across the Atlantic, if we can't figure out how to manage those border relations, then there's probably no hope for us to tell the rest of the world how they should manage theirs. So it's a good opportunity to start in our own backyard. And so this is very much sort of what this book is about. And so how do you build trust? And so the corollary to that is the international project that allows us to compare at a sub-state level what's happening between Canada and the United States. And I think this is the first project ever where we're systematically studying relations across the border at the sub-state level and across the entire border. And several of the contributors here are at the table. With some of the international patterns and how those have played out. And one of the interesting elements that you're going to notice here is that the places that seem to cooperate the closest in the world are also democracies. So there's a sense of trust and cooperation that democracy and democratic values can foster in terms of then generating the capacity to actually govern and administer some of those difficult dimensions of security. And I'm always a believer that security is ultimately the first mover. Why is it that so many people want to come to North America? Because they actually can feel secure here. And if you talk to sort of any immigrant and any refugee that kind of ended up in our various countries, that is sort of a key and a main driver. So how do we actually generate security, prosperity, and democracy, and build the governing institutions and the legitimacy behind those institutions to manage those? And so we built, as part of sort of an inductive sort of, I guess, approach out of these previous projects, a sort of matrix. And so this is, I think, one of the questions that Todd got me thinking about years ago. How do we actually, everybody talks about cross-border cooperation and so forth, but how do we actually build it? And how do we actually develop sort of an approach to how do we build it out incrementally? And so with Manuel's help and some other folks, we sort of built this matrix out about coordination, cooperation, collaboration. And so if you think about this as border communities, you can think about those as nascent, ascendant, and mature border communities. And so what sort of distinguishes them, without going through all sort of the details here, is that if you're coordinating, you're exchanging information. So you have an ability to talk to each other, to signal to each other, and actually to understand each other, and at least have some common assumptions about the world and some ability to actually correspond with one another about sort of some of the basic ways of how you're going to see the world. If you're cooperating, then you're building parallel structures on different sides of the border. And those don't necessarily need to be international borders. Those can be borders, indigenous borders, or other types of border communities where you've agreed on similar challenges, similar approaches, and you're building out similar governance sort of capacities to tackle these particular problems, and you've agreed on sort of common outcomes and related outputs from those efforts. And if you're collaborating, then you're actually starting to build joint institutions in order to tackle some of these challenges. And you don't need to fit necessarily into any one of these as a particular relationship. Rather, think of this as a segmented problem, where depending on what your particular policy challenge is, you might fit into one or another. And so I think if we understand a little bit of how people sort of fit and what's related to these different ways of actually building out policy approaches, then we can start to think a little bit about that literature on transgovernmental networks. So getting us again out of the methodological nationalism, if we think about many of the problems and the challenges that we face are fundamentally transgovernmental challenges, where there are global challenges and we need to build out networks that go beyond simple relationships between countries, but that involve sub-state players, that involve transnational players, and develop an opportunity to build out transnational norms and transnational approaches, whether that's financial crime or whether that's sort of how we cope with environmental change. That's sort of where the question becomes interesting, particularly interesting. And so just to give you a sense of sort of what the project that I'm going to try to lead with many of the collaborators here around the table. So the fundamental problem of how do there's a structure, the characteristics of the density of networks across non-territorial dyads, and to what extent that is a function of the nature of the interaction between regional state and non-state actors. So actually measuring those levels of cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. And these border dyes and networks will necessarily reflect the different degrees of cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. So then there's the question of the extent to which borders vacillate. That's ultimately, and to which we move borders in and borders out, is a function of these three C's. And that will manifest itself in different types and different characteristics of transgovernmental border networks. Why is that interesting? Because now we can actually start to measure the characteristics of these types of networks. And so the project then, in this particular case, investigates the trading relationships between border dyads, and we're particularly interested in the non-territorial border dyads. Hence the question about, for instance, airports and ports. So that is to say, points that trade with one another, and where I think in the first volume, more interested in goods than in people, because it's much easier to obtain data on goods than on people, because goods don't usually have serious privacy concerns about their data, so it's an easier way to measure things. So the approach that we're taking then is airports and seaports that are trading in cargo, and the fundamental problem they have is, and that states have, is that they have to reconcile scarcity of resources with an approach to managing risk. That is to say, how are they going to govern, administer, and manage their particular borders? And so you see this evolving, in this case, in sort of three particular, if you want, sort of our test communities, the European Union, North America, and the Trans-Tasman relationship. And so these have each built out their own particular networks in order to manage those trading relationships. We can measure how these three different communities trade with one another and reconcile rules and regulations in order to facilitate trade. And of course, the fact that they can do that is an important component, both of their security and the prosperity that they build out. But we're also interested in how these communities interact with the rest of the world. And so what can we learn comparatively from how each of them have built out those policy networks, how they work with one another, and how they work with the rest of the world. And so how do they do this? By pushing borders out, especially when it manifests in the kind of, and that'll manifest in the amount of data that authorities collect. So there's a simple quantitative capacity here, for instance, well in advance of cargo arriving, but also in the quality of the data that is available within these communities and across these communities. And the premise is then that the data that's being collected and shared is an indication of how managed and governed a border is, and the number and types of trade and customs arrangements within each region which in turn reflect the social, political, and security implications of these guides and networks and the underlying tension. Data sharing is one indication of the way borders are moving out and the way these trade regimes are adapting and pushing out these relationships beyond the borderline. And then what you have is vacillating borders as an implication of these trade practices, that borders correlate with the ordering and the trading relationships that these transnational policy networks build out.
There you go, and it works. All right, so the final one here, I'll try and get through this really quick because I'm keen to get some kind of conversation on these as well. This project is quite recently conceived actually, so it's still very much in its nascent stages, but came up with this as kind of a way to bridge some of the past success of the big 1.0 and bring this into 21st century borders. So really looking at, in the context of the globalized world, how we're looking at this, the open border paradox. So I don't need to go through this again. Following Christian kind of went over the key findings of big 1.0. And so this one is really trying to pull on some of the kind of the key themes that were uncovered with that. So whether that's the North American border or the regional perspectives that we looked at, but looking at these patterns that we identified for governing and managing this safe, secure, and open border idea. So we're looking at the centrality really of trust and reciprocity in border security as we look at the globalized world. So at the heart of this really is the necessity of border security, but not one in its kind of traditional sense of security, rather one that is looking at how we maintain this predictable and centrality again of trust in cross-border processes. So I'm going to skip through most of this because I realize we're very short on time, but at the heart of this, and this is something that Emmanuel always spoke about at length in coming up with this new project, is we're really looking at this shift from the spatial territory-based logic. So not just looking at borders as lines in the sand, for lack of better words, but that emerging spatial and mobile logic is really necessary to understand the shifts in challenging this state territory border tautology. So for this, the main part of this, the book, this is the book cover that I created the other day. The center part of this is drawing out the key findings of these 3 C's. So this coordination, cooperation, collaboration model, and asking what we're observing at each level of security. And that will draw in a lot of empirical work. So one of the key things, an example, one of the many examples that have come out of this is, for example, the Authorized Economic Operator program that comes out of World Customs Organization. So that's from our kind of global standard setter for customs organizations, how that is really being implemented. So I've had the opportunity to sit in on some of the verification processes that customs organizations have to put traders through, for example, to facilitate these trusted trader programs and the Authorized Economic Operator programs, and looking at how there's this free flow, what would appear to be free flow of trade and very easy trade, but really the processes behind that are something that we need to recognize. So the due diligence that customs agencies go through to have trusted traders gives the appearance of this open border. Whereas, like Christian was talking about with that open border paradox, it's not necessarily an open border. It's one that just has a lot of processes and governance feeding into it. So that's one of the things that will be an illumination, an example of how we consider border security in that in a more kind of mature state, because they also have these mutual recognition agreements with other countries. So in this case, I'm looking at Australia and their implementation of these AEOs, authorized economic operators, and how they cooperate with other countries. So they have a mutual reciprocal agreement with Canada, for example. So they're sharing trade information and they're sharing information on these traders. So we can really look at the security of goods and how that free flow in quotes is really managed and the procedures behind that. And what we also really want to look at are the implications of this level of bordering. So how can that really be pushed out, and how can we consider how this is pushing borders out beyond just that, again, that state-based logic and getting that real cooperation. The other key part of this book and the articles, of course, leading up to it are going to be looking at border governance. So again, what does management and what does governance look like across this 3C model? How can it be enabled? And what's needed really is some state-to-state cooperation or transgovernmental operations and coordination going to rest kind of within one of the Cs, for example? And is that all that is needed? Do we need collaboration on everything? Do we really need mature relationships, I guess, on all aspects of human mobility, trade, environment, defense, whatever the case may be? So looking at the necessity of it. So we are really looking at how border security is necessary, but it also takes on very different forms. It doesn't always have this traditional security look to it. It may be these background governance procedures, background management procedures that is really enabled by the border security landscape in a wider frame. So it's almost looking at how we're reframing and kind of reconceptualizing, redefining what border security means. And it does go beyond the traditional sense. So needless to say, this does fall quite clearly into the pillar 2 of things. So that's where this will be placed. Now, I probably don't need to go through all of this. One of the key ideas coming out of this is looking at how we can thematically organize some of the ideas that are shaped by this 3C model. So that could be immigration, military, customs. These all fall into this wider border security paradigm and how different governments are cooperating or not. And I think another key thing that's come out of a lot of discussions with the 3C model is that we haven't really considered conflict as one of the models within it. And there are, of course, conflict borders. So if we look at North Korea, for example, and that's not going to fall anywhere into this 3Cs. So drawing in some of the blockades, I guess, to the 3C model and looking at how in a globalized world we come to meet our shared objectives when we do have to consider those types of borders as well. So I will go through all of that because I'm probably out of time, but yeah, keen for some conversation on that. I can't get through because I think I had to cut it over.
Okay.
Nice.
Quick comments from me. Just, on the 3C model, I also am the founder of the Future Borders Coalition, which is 100 airports in North America, railroads, shipping, cruise ships, trucking. And the big problem we saw happen during COVID was the governments were so stuck in the mud. The private sector had everything sorted out. So it's not just transgovernmental networks, it's the private, everything's moving so quick. The private sector has the technology to do the digitalization and make things work, but the government's not listening to them. So we need to have that connection between the people who use the border and who ship the goods, and the governments have to engage. And it was total broken down. Anyway, that's the first thing I saw. The second thing I was, for Lori's, that little flood was the largest flood in Canada. I mean, it was the $5 billion, the largest port in Canada was cut off from the whole country for 3 weeks. And it will happen tomorrow if we have the same atmospheric river because the problem's not solved. So we have a huge international inability to deal with a very obvious problem. And both governments are going to get very, the people will be so upset because they know about it. It will happen again. Nothing's happened in 18 months. Anyway, so it's a really critical issue. I'm glad you're studying it. Anyway, those are my 2 comments.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay? Can I ask a question? It would be either to Jamie or Christiane, maybe to you. I really like your 3C model. It's actually helpful for me when I'm thinking about the BC Washington connections, but I'm wondering how you approach like shocks and disruptions. So like the Nexus program in Canada and US is a good example of one that would fit all of those C's in a very advanced model. It was disrupted and now it's not functioning how it was intended and it may never function that way again. So how will you incorporate these shocks?
Can we just hold that? Because I want to make sure we use the time that we have efficiently. I want to make sure Manuel gets time in and that everyone else gets time in. So we just kind of collect the questions and then see what time we have for everybody to respond.
Okay.
But Lori, the 3C models, actually doesn't really focus on that question. This is why the new projects are actually addressing this. Right? The 3C model is really focusing on what we have observed. Certain actors have the ability to progressively become very close, almost to have the same policies across a certain territory in different matters of security, broadly understood. What you're discussing is what happens when this is disrupted. It comes from a critique of the assumption that you need to share the same culture to align policies. And what it suggests is that actually it's not culture that is involved. Because what we observed across all our case studies is that it's regulatory alignment. It's agreeing on basic accountability across different aspects of policy making. So transparency is the key and reciprocity is the key. Public choice theory, right? Ostrom, nothing else. Now we need to see what is disrupted, what happened. My comments, I wanted to actually comment more to my colleagues than to the papers. You have here examples of what I would like to see and hear over the next 8 different panels that we have prepared this conference. They all have papers, right? But they're thinking the future. How is, I think every single one of them is like, we have this knowledge. How are we going to think forward? How are we going beyond what we have already established, right? I think it's very important that we have these discussions that are every day at the conference, across every one of the sessions that are so-called labeled big sessions, we have these kind of discussions. So I know you came with papers, but you have time to go beyond the paper, think about, okay, pillar 1, pillar 2, how do I address these? What are the policy implications? And if you do this, if you make the small effort to pause and raise those points at the end of every one of your presentations, by the end of the week, every one of us is going to think differently about the research that we are undertaking together in 21st century borders, right? And that's very important. Policy implication, I just wanted to highlight this. Some of the colleagues here are much closer in their thinking to policymakers than others. And I think it's really important to take this as an important factor, sometime of thinking differently. Where does it come that, all the work on security, if you look back at the work that has been done, like the triumvirate here, Todd, Jamie, Todd, and Christian. 2 of the writers here have worked in those sectors for many, many years, right? They are academics towards the end of they're new academics in a way, right? And so I think it's really important. And then Glory works extremely closely to Penwork. And other works also in the circumpolar nodes, like the discussion that we have is driven by this. Well, she wants to study the organization, the multitude of organizations. She wants to look at the educational system, right? It's driven by these people. So what we do there is we give voice, right? We are not speaking for these communities, but we give voice, we document, we help them have a voice, and we lift up those conversations and conceptualize them, right? It's very important. I just wanted to speak to you because I think it illustrates what I would like us to do over the next 4 days. And then Wednesday, we're having a break, but I know this is when we're having the break on the bus that everybody's going to start discussing this. So use the Wednesday to relax. One of my PhD supervisors, Bob Young, said the Friday beer is the most creative time of the week. This is when we think about our best paper. That's what's going to happen on Wednesday. These are my comments. The floor is yours.
I just have a comment on this democratic liberal border theory. See, as far as theories are concerned, the liberal theories, there is a free trade peace theory, there is a democratic peace theory. And we have seen time and again that all these theories has their own limitations. So border, and one of the questions that always remain among the border studies scholars is that, is there a border theory or should we have a border theory? We have conceptualized border. At least there's a consensus that border means a division. It can be mental, economic, psychological, political. It's a kind of a division that it isn't. So when you say liberal democratic border, I feel like how are you going to define liberalism? Is that economic liberalism? Because yes, that really facilitates. But if liberal means political, then that political at times also change. So I think you need to be a little careful on this because this is an interesting project, and whatever you are going to write is, I think it may stay for a lot, and it may really create a lot of curiosity amongst other scholars as well. So this liberal democratic border, how you are going to define it is very, very important.
Other comments, questions? I'll give everybody a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, it's just a comment. Probably Jamie and Christian and others already thought about this. Your triple C framework, you mentioned conflict at the end and creating another vertical category, but another way to go at that is actually to add another dimension across the chart. And so how is tension and then conflict handled within each one of those? And then there's perhaps the threat, right? So it's just a suggestion.
Christian, I really like the way you and several of the others have developed what you've already done in the big project and moved on incrementally and also by expanding both the empirical and the theoretical aspects of this as you move on. And I would think that others in the room and others in the project who are not here should be thinking about that as well, because we built up a very substantial knowledge base as
we will have all of the articles, DOI, all of the published work, the 109 available on our website.
Yeah.
You'll go on the website, like within 2 months, click on the DOI, get it.
Yeah. And
all of this will be there.
I just wanted to raise one aspect related to that, and that is that we have to then also take that additional step of trying to cross some of those lines. We didn't develop silos. Fortunately, we interacted quite effectively, but let's just use the Akwesasne as an example. We've already had a number of projects done on Akwesasne. And some are very cultural in orientation. Others are more governance related. But if you're going to be developing that, the cross-referencing, the linkage I think is extremely important in terms of moving on with this.
Other reactions? Anybody want to? Oh, so 2 more reactions.
Yeah, just 2 quick observations. Thank you, Heather, for the introduction of U-Arctic and education and the significance of it. And I just thought of, there are a lot of thoughts, but just really quickly too. One is sort of the unevenness in terms of access to the Arctic. So those in the Arctic have limited access to everything that's available, but there's unevenness across borders, right? The Nordic states and their ability in contrast to, ancient connections that are still being used, and it's an infrastructure issue. That as well as this, and I think it's a tension, the way I see it anyway, the interest of forces, very powerful forces outside of the Arctic, driving a lot of what happens, within you Arctic. And essentially what I'm saying is that many of the others that come from a scientific or Western science background have no clue or no desire to even look at the elements of IK, for example, which I understand to be an element of the project that you want to look into. But we can talk on the sidelines more about that. But I can see how
science
it could be.
diplomacy idea. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sanjay?
Yeah, I'll be very quick because I know it's an excellent presentation, Jimmy. I have only one concern, which is that, the very nature of state itself is changing now. We look at leaking borders of various states. Secondly, borders as institutions, borders as identities. We find borders, for example, in South Asia at very diverse locations. So how do we, the moment we pluralize the concept of border and the concept of security, a very complex picture emerges. So I think looking ahead, we are likely to see more and more inverted commas around both these terms, border and security. This is all that I wanted to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, I was going to ask something very similar. Jenny, you said in the end, this is good for the state and this is bad for the state. So what is the state? Who is the state? I mean, who is the state just institutions, or is the state the people that are that the state is representing? And who is accountable for what? And what accountability is there to border security is, I think, one also a very transversal question.
Manuel, did you want to?
I think we need to go. Yeah, 4:25.
Is it?
That's what my watch was.
David's about to come through and remind us.
The number of people to sign these sheets are in the room. The only people who are not signing are UV. That's all. The ones who are part of the, I mean, we need to sign this document, so I know you. Okay, so I hope that this is helpful. This is our chance to think for a few days. Please attend each other's sessions. I know most of you are giving 2 papers, so but please try to attend the big sessions and come and discuss this for the next 8. We have 8 sessions together, starting tomorrow. Matt, thank you. No, the taxis are downstairs. It's a rush. We have enough to take everybody down to the beach. I hope you brought your swimsuit or your wetsuit. I have mine. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm welcome. Yeah, we're going to walk so Jamie.
So, Beyond
I would like to ask you about your